Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome back to History 102, World Civilizations Since 1500. I'm Dr. Haynes, and I'll be talking with you today about economic globalization. And the Walmart Corporation will serve as a kind of through line for us. I'll refer back to it repeatedly over the course of the lecture. So, when I spoke with you last, I said that in 1989 the Berlin Wall came down, and within a few years nearly every communist state, including the Soviet Union, ceased to exist. But, or I should say by 1991, with the Cold War over and communism largely defeated, the Cold War world order came to an end. And a new world order began to emerge. So, that new world order was in part defined by economic globalization. When most people talk about globalization, they are referring to the immense acceleration in international economic transactions that began in the 1950s, sped up through the 60s, 70s, 80s, and 90s, and really continues into the present. So globalization can mean a lot of different things, but when most people talk about it, when they use it in the vernacular, they're referring to economic globalization. This immense acceleration of international economic transactions that began in the 1950s, gained speed for several decades, and that really continues into the present. Goods, capital, and people circulated further, faster, and in larger quantities than ever before during this period of economic globalization. You don't have to write down the numbers, but I want to just give you, one metric to give you a sense of the scale. World trade skyrocketed from just $57 billion with a B in 1947 to a value of more than $18 trillion, trillion with a T, from $57 billion with a B in 1947 to $18 trillion with a T by 2012. That's just staggering growth in global economic transactions in a relatively short period of time. Now, for decades, lots of people have viewed economic globalization as a process that is natural, inevitable, and entirely positive. But in recent years, or well, I should say really throughout that time, globalization has encouraged gross inequality between nations and within them. And in recent years, because of that gross inequality, there is a growing backlash against economic globalization. So, our major questions about economic globalization will be these. What factors contribute to it? And what factors contribute to economic globalization? And question 2, how has economic globalization produced both staggering economic growth and gross economic inequality? Really, in a sense, globalization is kind of the wrong term for this process taking place in the late 20th century. This immense acceleration in international economic transactions. Really, the trend is something more like re-globalization. Think about it. Throughout this course, we have examined the creation of a world economic system from the age of exploration in the 1400s all the way through the new imperialism of the 1800s. But that older world economic system collapsed in the aftermath of World War I, and especially with the catastrophic failure of capitalism in the Great Depression. But this re-globalization trend that has occurred in the late 20th century is much different in scope and speed than that older world economic system. Consider Walmart. Walmart is one of the largest transnational corporations on planet Earth. And it is a quintessential case study of late 20th century economic globalization. The factors that have allowed for Walmart's tremendous growth are the same factors that have allowed for economic globalization more generally. So we can learn a lot from a Walmart case study. So just to bring it right home to you, I'm going to bet that every one of you lives within 20 minutes of at least one Walmart. I live within 20 minutes of 3 Walmart stores. The corporation has 11,000 stores in 28 countries worldwide. The corporation employs 2.2 million people. And its annual revenue for 2017 was $500 billion. The corporation is enormous and ubiquitous. Indeed, put it another way, give you a sense of the size of Walmart as an economic unit. If Walmart was a country, its economy would rank 13th in the world, larger than most actual countries. So, what are the factors that contributed to economic globalization in general and the astonishing growth of the Walmart Corporation and to other transnational corporations like it? What are the factors? I'm going to draw your attention to 3 that I think are most important, or at least very important. And these 3 factors are closely connected, closely related. There's a lot of overlap. The Bretton Woods system, neoliberalism, and the free movement of capital, resources, and people, especially to and from China. China's going to be our big case study there. The Bretton Woods system, neoliberalism, and the free movement of capital, resources, and people. First, we'll deal with the Bretton Woods system. The Bretton Woods system and the economic philosophy known as neoliberalism. In 1944, as World War II was coming to an end, the modern global economy really took shape at the Bretton Woods Conference. World leaders from the great capitalist countries, especially the United States, were very eager to promote free market capitalism in the post-war world. But they were also very eager to avoid capitalism's failure, as it had in the Great Depression. So, the leaders of the world's capitalist country hold this conference at Bretton Woods in New Hampshire. And at this meeting, they hammer out the rules of a new global economic system. At this meeting, they also created two very important institutions that continue to shape the global economy today: the World Bank and the International Monetary Fund, or IMF. International Monetary Fund. International Monetary Fund, or IMF. Leaders mean for these rules and for these institutions created at Bretton Woods to promote and especially protect capitalism by doing two things: promote free trade and stimulate capital investment across borders. Promote free trade and stimulate capital investment across borders. So, as your textbook describes it, the World Bank is created to loan money to nations in need of an economic jumpstart after the war. And the IMF, the International Monetary Fund, is there to provide emergency loans if countries get jammed up. So think of them as a kind of safety net for global capitalism. It's there in case the economy starts to fail again. However, loans from these institutions come with strings attached. To get a loan from the World Bank or the IMF, poor countries had to adopt free market and pro-business policies that did not necessarily benefit them. So the Bretton Woods system kind of ropes a lot of countries into the process of economic globalization. The kind of economic globalization created by the Bretton Woods system, and it continues, for the next several decades, is often known or often described as neoliberalism. Neoliberalism. So let's talk for a minute about the economic philosophy of neoliberalism. Like globalization itself, neoliberalism can mean a lot of different things, but in the most basic sense, neoliberalism means total freedom from any government restriction on any economic activity anywhere in the world. Total freedom from any government restriction on any economic activity anywhere in the world. So, think back over the course of the semester and put neoliberalism in its historical context. Think all the way back to the free market economic liberalism described by Adam Smith in his 1776 book, The Wealth of Nations. Think also back to the 1930s and British economist John Maynard Keynes. Keynes emphasized government spending and government regulations to protect people from the failures of free market capitalism. Starting around the 1950s, economists like this guy, Milton Friedman. Starting in the 1950s, economists like Milton Friedman drew on that 18th century liberalism to challenge Keynesian ideas. People like Friedman developed neoliberalism. In theory, neoliberalism stresses individual competition, private enterprise, in a free market. Governments existed to police the system, make sure there's a level playing field. In theory. In practice, encouraged by neoliberal thinkers, capitalist countries, including the US and Great Britain, abandoned many regulations on economic activity. Things like tariffs. And business people increasingly viewed the entire world as one single open market. A couple of notes on the history of Walmart can help us see some of the ramifications of neoliberal thought. And it can really get at one of the great paradoxes of neoliberal thought and economic globalization. Globalization is built on neoliberal thought, neoliberalism. Neoliberalism stresses individual enterprise, competition in a free market, policed by governments to make sure there's a level playing field. But the reality is that government action and inherited wealth often create the conditions that allow globalization to thrive. Walmart is the quintessential example. Sam Walton, the founder of the Walmart Corporation, graduated from college in the 1940s and went on to work in several retail chain stores, including JCPenney, one with which you may be familiar. But Walton made his first real money the old-fashioned way. He married a rich girl. It's a true story. He married well. He married up. He and his wife used her trust fund and her family's land as collateral for their first major business loan. Walton also tapped regional investors, especially people connected to the oil industry in Houston. Many of those regional investors, those Houston oil barons, had gotten their start in the 1930s during the Great Depression. Which sounds weird, right? How's anybody getting a good business start in the 1930s? Well, those Houston oil barons had benefited from New Deal government spending. New Deal government spending programs meant to stimulate the economy. We don't need to go into details, but in short, many of these Houston oil barons received loans backed by New Deal agencies within the federal government. They got better terms than they could get from private banks, Wall Street banks. So, therein lies one of these great paradoxes of neoliberal economic globalization. The roots of Walmart, this mighty neoliberal transnational corporation, lie in anti-liberal Keynesian economic policy and inherited wealth. Right, Sam Walton started his business using his wife's inherited wealth, and the fortunes Texas oil men had built using low-interest government loans. Now, the Waltons opened their first Walmart discount city store in 1962, and they steadily expanded from there. The rise of Walmart can also teach us about the inequality that characterizes neoliberal economic globalization. In particular, Walmart illustrates the transformation from an industrial economy to a service economy in the United States in particular. So what does that transformation look like? From an industrial economy to a service economy. Think back to our lectures on the Industrial Revolution, industrialization. From at least the 1910s, possibly a little bit earlier in the United States, but from the 1910s at least, all the way up through, say, the 1970s, the United States had an industrial economy. Factories produced high-quality, durable goods, and industrial workers made relatively high wages, so they could purchase the products they made, from electronics to, of course, cars. That is, factory workers in the U.S. for most of the 20th century enjoyed an upper middle class lifestyle. Particularly in the 1950s and 1960s, the U.S. was workshop to the world. Right? Think about it. All of the other industrialized nations had been devastated by World War II. So America was workshop to the world until those nations got back on their feet. American factory workers had the highest salaries of industrial workers anywhere in the world. The American middle class peaked. It reached its greatest size about 1970. And the American middle class has been shrinking ever since. Middle class purchasing of consumer goods helped create a whole new economic sector, the service sector, and to serve the needs of middle class consumers. In Walmart country, the so-called Sun Belt from the southeast all the way across Texas and into the southwest, Walmart country, the Sun Belt, economies had largely skipped that industrial phase, and they moved straight into the service phase. The southeast and the southwest never had great industrial cities like Detroit. So in the 1950s and the 1960s, many parts of the American Sun Belt sort of moved directly into the service sector. The traditional agrarian economy of the U.S. South got replaced by a service economy. Walmart and corporations like it helped to create this nation of service sector workers, clerks and lower management, rather than workers on the factory floor. And entry-level service workers typically earn much less than entry-level industrial workers. Now, if we zoom out a little bit, from a single country to the larger stage, we can learn a little bit more about neoliberalism, economic globalization, and the inequality it encourages. So consider the North American Free Trade Agreement, or NAFTA. NAFTA, the North American Free Trade Agreement, is a good place to witness neoliberal principles in action. In short, I'm going to argue that neoliberal globalization policies benefit transnational corporations, often at the expense of nations themselves and at least some individual workers. Neoliberal globalization policies benefit transnational corporations at the expense of nations themselves and at least some individual workers. And in so doing, they increase inequality between nations and within them. And of course, in the US, that means contributing to that transition from an industrial economy to a service economy. So what is NAFTA? And what does it do? NAFTA is an agreement between the United States, Canada, and Mexico that was implemented in 1994. The goal of these leaders from the US, Canada, and Mexico was to create the world's largest neoliberal free trade zone. And tear down those barriers to trade between the countries in North America. NAFTA enjoyed wide bipartisan support when it was created. However, as this image suggests, NAFTA had its detractors even back in the 90s. And of course, the current administration has spared no criticism of the agreement and is currently working to renegotiate it. But back in the 90s, as NAFTA was being negotiated, critics favored tariffs. They want tariffs on imported goods because tariffs artificially increase the price of cheap foreign imports. And that makes it easier for domestic-made products to compete. NAFTA critics in the United States warn that if you lift all the tariffs, that'll just encourage corporations to close factories in the US and build new factories just across the border in Mexico. In Mexico, labor's cheaper, corporations can pollute the environment freely instead of running clean factories. Dirty factories are cheaper. So corporations could increase their profits by moving manufacturing operations out of the United States. Mexican farmers also criticized NAFTA. Mexican farmers were terrified. They would be ruined by competition from American agribusiness. Why? Government support. the United States government gets or gives huge subsidies to American agribusiness, allowing them to sell produce far cheaper than Mexican farmers could sell produce for. Neoliberal thinkers say, everybody calm down. Your criticisms are phony. Neoliberal thinkers insist that removing restrictions on all economic activity will promote economic growth for everyone, everywhere. And that's what mattered. Growth. So NAFTA gets enacted in 1994. It creates the world's largest free trade zone, or what was then the world's largest free trade zone. Tariffs and other regulations effectively disappeared. And of course, so have lots of manufacturing jobs in the United States. For example, the textile industry in the U.S. South collapsed in the late 1990s after NAFTA. As many expected, U.S. corporations moved their factories to Mexico, where they could exploit cheaper labor and freely pollute. So who benefits? Who benefits from this quintessential neoliberal free trade agreement? Transnational corporations benefit. The Walmarts, the General Motors of the world. Neoliberal globalization policies create a single world market that benefits transnational corporations at the expense of countries themselves and at the expense of many workers. As early as 2000, 51 of the world's 100 largest economic units were not countries, but transnational corporations. Transnational corporations are always on the lookout to move operations to a cheaper venue. Just as one example, during one 5-year period, the Nike Corporation closed 20 factories. Yet it opened 35 other factories, often thousands of miles apart. Indeed, thanks to neoliberal economic globalization policies, the very idea of a product manufactured in one country is largely obsolete. Think again about Walmart. On the Walmart shelves, the Walmart nearest you, you can buy the classic American doll for girls, Barbie dolls, manufactured by the Mattel Corporation. Mattel manufactures Barbies at factories in China, Indonesia, and Malaysia, using molds from the United States, using plastic and hair from Taiwan, and using cotton cloth from China itself. So the very idea that a product is made in one single location is largely obsolete. Neoliberal policies are a very good way to maximize corporate profits, but they can be devastating to communities and to individuals. And this really gets at one of the central defining features of neoliberal economic globalization. increasing inequality between nations and within them. The multi-billionaire financier George Soros put it pretty succinctly as early as the year 2000. He said, "The global capitalist system has produced a very uneven playing field. The gap between the rich and the poor is getting wider." And he was right. When major corporations leave communities like Hamilton, Ohio, or Swannanoa, North Carolina, or Detroit, Michigan, the tax base collapses. So let's put some thought into that. When a corporation leaves, it can devastate a community by destroying the tax base. What does that look like to communities? No more tax revenue from the corporations themselves. No more income taxes from factory workers earning good, middle-class wages. Declining sales taxes as people stop buying anything but necessities. Declining property values, and consequently declining property taxes, as people have to sell their houses on the cheap so they can migrate for new jobs in new places. So when a factory leaves, when a corporation leaves a community, the tax base is severely eroded. At their highest point, corporations in the United States paid something like 30% of all federal taxes. Now they contribute only about 10 or 12% of all federal taxes. And that means individuals pick up the slack. Right? Individuals bear the largest portion of the burden. Okay, so what does that mean? An eroding tax base means less money for basic public services. Roads, schools, police, fire protection. In short, a rapidly declining quality of life. As long as there's a cheaper venue somewhere in the global marketplace, transnational corporations will move to the lowest bidder. And that process is facilitated by neoliberal policies. So neoliberal policies can contribute to inequality between nations and within them. Now, lots of transnational corporations have moved their manufacturing operations to Asia, to places like Vietnam, Bangladesh, Indonesia, and especially China. So in that sense, China is actually the most impressive example of economic globalization. It's a neoliberal success story. But in a weird, specifically Chinese kind of way. When we started this course, way back in the 1500s, we talked about China as this very powerful, very prosperous, yet reclusive, inward-looking country. They had the coolest stuff in the world, luxury goods like silk and porcelain and spices, which they exported to the rest of the world, but didn't import much. Had no need to import much. Then in the middle of the course, we talked about this 100-year period from about the Opium Wars in the mid-1800s through the Communist Revolution in 1949. This 100-year period where China was really exploited by European and Japanese imperialism. Yet, today, China is second only to the United States in global economic power. So how did this happen? Beginning in the 1970s, Communist China opened its markets to the world. Chinese authorities encouraged foreign investment, and they imported foreign technology. You can get a real sense of this in one of your readings for the day. For today, you were supposed to read this 1984 speech by Deng Xiaoping, China's premier leader from 1978 to 1989. And in this speech, Deng Xiaoping justifies China's participation in economic globalization. He says, let's see, about 4 paragraphs in, Deng Xiaoping says that the purpose of Chinese socialism is to provide economically for all Chinese people. And he says that to do that, this calls for highly developed, productive forces and an overwhelming abundance of material wealth. Okay? Then he says that to produce that abundance of material wealth, a state-controlled economy participating in globalization is actually better than free market capitalism. He writes that the superiority of the socialist system is demonstrated in the final analysis by faster and greater development of those economic forces than under the capitalist system. And he kind of repeats that theme a couple more times in that speech. So, China still has a state-managed, state-controlled economy. Yet it has embraced some elements of neoliberal economic globalization. Which is weird, right? Because many neoliberal thinkers insist economic globalization ensures individual freedom. That it's incompatible with communism. But in reality, economic globalization and authoritarian government mix really well. China proves the truth of that. Exports are the heart of the Chinese economy. Exports fuel China's phenomenal economic growth. Although there are economists who think that Chinese consumers themselves are the next great consumer market. For the moment, it's exports that drive the Chinese economy. Consider China's Pearl River Delta. In 1979, the Chinese government designated the Pearl River Delta as a special economic zone. The head note to your Deng Xiaoping speech for the day mentions these special economic zones. The Pearl River Delta is a concrete example. Chinese special economic zones, like the Pearl River Delta, offer low corporate taxes, few environmental or urban planning regulations, and they allow the free movement of capital and profits in and out of the region. low corporate taxes, few environmental or urban planning regulations, and the free movement of capital and profits in and out of the zone. The results are pretty staggering. The gross domestic product in the Pearl River Delta jumped from just $8 billion in, that's supposed to be 1980, that's a typo. $8 billion in 1980 to $350 billion in 2006. The population of the Pearl River Delta jumped 20-fold. And the Guangdong province, which encompasses most of the Pearl River Delta Special Economic Zone, came to produce a third of all of China's exports. And of course, that brings us back to Walmart. Walmart's world purchasing headquarters is based in the Pearl River Delta. 70% of Walmart products contain components from China. The local port in the Pearl River Delta, the Yantian International Container Terminal, it's the fourth largest port in the world. And Walmart-bound cargoes get top priority aboard these enormous container ships. So, this is the shape of neoliberal economic globalization in the late 20th century. And Walmart is one of the leaders. Walmart in China emphasize this weird paradox at the center of economic globalization. And it's built on the philosophy of neoliberalism. Neoliberalism stresses private enterprise over government intervention. Yet government intervention often creates the conditions that allow globalization to thrive. Globalization encourages economic inequality within countries and between them. And that fact, that inequality, has begun to produce a backlash. The neoliberal economic system failed dramatically when the global economy collapsed in 2008, triggering the worst economic downturn since the 1930s. And we saw the backlash against neoliberalism in the 2016 presidential election. Indeed, the emergence of right-wing and neo-fascist political movements in the US and Europe is a central part of the backlash. But the most extreme form of backlash against globalization is terrorism. And Dr. Ross will begin to address that subject next time.